Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Another episode of Topic Discuss, where we will be exploring the world of critical thinking, how we can use evidence to make decisions that we can be confident in, to understand when evidence is reliable and when it's not reliable, and how to make those discernments. We'll also dive a little bit into logical fallacies and how bad arguments can be recognized, most importantly within yourself. So join us tonight for another episode of Topic Discuss. Welcome, viewers, to another episode of Topic Discuss. And tonight's episode is one of my more favorite topics. I really enjoy thinking about and talking about critical thinking and what critical thinking means and how we can use it in our everyday lives. So I'm going to tell a story. I can remember back in 2007, I think, Oprah Winfrey interviewed Jenny McCarthy. And when she interviewed her, Jenny McCarthy was there to tell the world, really, that that vaccines cause autism. That her son had autism, he had these seizures and was diagnosed by her physician. I can't actually remember his name, but her physician, who was born in 1948, actually wasn't, and I don't know if he's still alive, he's got to be in close to 80, really propagated this idea that the vaccines cause autism. And which is really fascinating to me, because that timeline, if he was born in 1948, he would have lived through polio and would have recognized the importance of vaccines. But I want to just use the example of Jenny McCarthy and logical fallacies that occurred because of that episode on Oprah. So what is that? So what does that have to, or how do we kind of identify that logical fallacy? So logical fallacies, and I'm going to actually just quickly read off a list of logical fallacies. And I don't know that we're going to be able to go through them all tonight. I really want to focus on real life examples where we see logical fallacies and poor critical thinking. But the different logical fallacies that I know of, and that I'm reading right here off of my iPad, is straw man fallacy or straw person fallacy, if you want to be gender inclusive. So straw person, faulty generalization, false dilemma, equivocation, slippery slope, ad hominem. We'll talk about ad hominem tonight specifically. Argumentum ad populum, red herring, begging the question, circular reasoning, appeal to authority. We'll talk about appeal to authority. Appeal to ignorance. Tu cuque, I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm sure if I'm not, someone in comments can correct me how to pronounce that. Appeal to ignorance. Ignoratio elenchi, or elenchi. Argumentum in moderation. post hoc ergo propter hoc. I didn't say that right. No true Scotsman. And right now, we're seeing a lot of the no true Scotsman thing happening right now. And I'm just going to give an example. So Kaepernick, when he kneels during the national anthem, critics of his will say, well, Ben Shapiro, for example, will say, well, if he really wants to make a statement, a true patriot would actually do it a different way. So he's not doing it the right way. He's not making his statement about racism the right way by kneeling during the national anthem. And that's actually a logical fallacy, because it uses the argument that no true Scotsman or no true patriot or no true American or no true Christian would do this, and therefore what they're doing and Kaepernick's kneeling at the national anthem is somehow not valid or wrong. And so I think that's a really kind of a fun one. No true Scotsman. Special pleading, appeal to emotion, and I want to talk about that in more detail. Formal fallacy, false equivalencies. We're going to talk about false equivalencies tonight for sure. Questionable cause, and then affirming the consequent. So I want to go back to appeal to emotion. And what scholars, and I'll put my references in the description below so you can go and see where my references are coming from. And I'm going to tell you later in the episode tonight why I do that, and it relates to critical thinking, because I don't ever want someone to watch a podcast of mine and say, well, I heard this podcast and this guy really sounded like he knew what he was talking about. I would much rather you figure that out through your own diligent research through critical thinking. And so we're going to talk about that too. But to start with logical fallacies and critical thinking, first of all, critical thinking really, I think about Socrates as described by Plato, Aristotle, really were some of the founding forefathers, I would say, for critical thinking and being reasonable and rational in the way that you are thinking. And one of my favorite things about Socrates is that he really enjoyed deep conversation and deep discussion, as do I, right? That's part of why I have this podcast. I really value deep discussion, and I think that does help. And according to Socrates, it does help to critically think and not just accept something because you've heard it from someone you love and respect. Remember, the opinion of someone you love and respect is not evidence. So in this world of philosophy with Socrates and critical thinking, one of the main driving factors in logical fallacies is actually our emotions. And so the appeal to emotion, I would almost say, and I'm not an expert in this at all, but in my research, I kind of view the appeal to emotion or emotion as a category of logical fallacies, right? So when you think about our emotions and how our emotions might drive the premise upon which we are going to drive to a conclusion, then it can often lead to mistakes in our judgment. I am not saying that we shouldn't be emotional. We are emotional beings. But a phrase that I really like to talk about with people in my life is emotional intelligence. So if we need to understand our emotions, we need to have high EQ or high emotional intelligence, like a high IQ, which really means that we've studied our own emotions. We understand where they're coming from. We're not completely driven by them, but we're aware of them and we know what they mean, which means we've taken time to understand what might trigger an emotion, what our patterns of emotion are. Sometimes those patterns will depend upon the time of the day or the time of the week, or a certain time in our lives. So where emotions can create a logical fallacy is when we have a low emotional intelligence. We have not really explored our emotions, where they're coming from, and oftentimes that leads to magical thinking. I feel a certain way, therefore this thing must be true. And that's actually the basis for many of these logical fallacies. So I don't know that we have time tonight to really dive into every one of these logical fallacies. I'm going to put in some YouTube clips where I think some individuals do a great job explaining each of the logical fallacies. I find it more interesting to take real life examples and really walk through those examples with a critical thinking mind. So the other area, so emotion, number one. Emotion is a category of logical fallacies. They're emotionally based. Secondary to that is populism, or popularity, not populism, popularity. So I would use popularity as another category of logical fallacies. So let's just use that. Let's use Jenny McCarthy as an example. So this is in 2007. Google was around. 1998 was when Google kind of came onto the scene, I think. And then in 2007, Oprah Winfrey interviews Jenny McCarthy about her son who had autism. And immediately there's an appeal to emotion, right? Especially parents who have children. We don't want to, of course, I mean, I'm a parent of 5 beautiful children. I would never want to do anything to harm them. I'm also a healthcare professional. I've worked in healthcare my whole career. So when I watched Jenny McCarthy on Oprah Winfrey, I just thought, how could this be happening? Because I knew from my own experience, I mean, I had been vaccinated myself. Just to work in healthcare, you have to be vaccinated oftentimes, and even vaccinated with vaccines the general public doesn't generally get. And I didn't sterilize me because I have 5 kids. Just in case you're wondering how those were made, it was by me. So not sterilized by vaccines. And my wife. I don't mean to say I was the only one that created those beautiful kids, but I contributed. And so anyway, so I think that it was stunning to me to watch this. And I can remember specifically on that show that Jenny McCarthy's line of evidence was Google. And she actually said to Oprah, "Thank goodness for Google." And then Oprah said to her, "Yeah, thank goodness for Google." And at that time, we just didn't understand that Google may have inaccurate information. But it's because we came from a time when we kind of felt comfortable with encyclopedias that our parents had, the big books on the bookshelf that were valid or validated. We could trust those sources. So I think we just immediately, and I'm making this up, but in my mind, I feel like we kind of immediately trusted Google as a source. Not knowing how to, not knowing what information really could be out there on Google that is not verified or validated or even evidence. It's a giant opinion echo chamber, right? And so it becomes increasingly difficult to understand what data we can trust. And it makes us lazy too, because we can do, like Jenny McCarthy did, a quick Google search, and it led her to down a path and a road that confirmed her bias that vaccines caused her son's autism. And she had that bias because her provider, her pediatrician, had that bias, right? Now, I can't go into, I'll say this, vaccines and anti-vaccine kind of concepts have been around for a long time. Some of the first smallpox vaccines that were available during the Civil War, or was it the Revolutionary War? I forget. It was a while ago, and I think it might have been the Revolutionary War. Anyway, the United Kingdom, Britain, really was. There were physicians there that were anti-vaxxers. They were anti-smallpox, but vaccines. But what began to happen is that the evidence showed that soldiers who became sick and died from smallpox versus the soldiers that didn't die. So when you see an army vaccinated having a better survival rate than an army that's not vaccinated, you then begin to gather evidence. So this is not new, but what is new is the social media platforms. And social media wasn't even really around too much. I mean, Facebook was 3 years old by this time in 2007, but we didn't have Google, until that point, really being used as, kind of a reliable source. Since then, Google has tried to provide warnings and try to provide evidence to help people to understand when they're seeing something that's a logical fallacy or it's not true. But one of the things that I think is interesting about the Jenny McCarthy story is that her pediatrician had an anti-vaccination viewpoint. And this becomes challenging because one of the logical fallacies is a false authority, right? Or an appeal to authority. And in religion, this is really common, right? When someone is self-proclaimed, they saw Jesus, like Paul, the apostle, who was not an actual witness of Jesus, but claimed to see him. Now Paul's an authority, right? So now he's the authority on the doctrine of Christ. But he really, is he an authority? Is he even more of an authority than Peter? In fact, you'll see Peter, and there's kind of an argument there, who's in charge or who has the correct doctrine of Christ. So you'll see this in religion. You'll see this, in many ways. So you might see that a doctor. So another example with Oprah Winfrey is she's kind of promoted fake stuff, hasn't she? But anyway, Dr. Phil. I love Dr. Phil's shows. I just want to be clear, though, Dr. Phil is not a psychologist, and he does not have a license to practice psychiatry. He has a doctorate in psychology. So that's a false authority or an appeal to authority that's not really, he isn't really an expert, right? So then how do you reconcile in your mind this pediatrician who's a physician for children? Well, one of the things to remember about false authority, especially in healthcare, is that healthcare and other highly technical fields have subspecialties. Those subspecialties really are the experts. So epidemiologists are experts that pediatricians rely on. I worked in the ICU at one point in my career. And in the critical care unit, in the critical care area, you have a multitude of clinical experts. An intensivist who's excellent at intubating a patient is going to consult with the infectious disease physician when the patient has an infection, even though that intensivist has background knowledge to treat the infection. He's going to, or she is going to, connect with and rely on the expert in infectious disease, because that's the true authority. So one thing that I think happens with people where they get confused is that they hear that someone's a doctor, and then therefore what they're saying is completely accurate, and it kind of confirms the bias. So that happened with Jenny McCarthy, a pediatrician who was not an expert in virology or in vaccines or epidemiology. and a pediatrician, right? So his expertise is limited. And you can see in his own writings that he had his own biases about vaccines and wasn't really willing to look at the data. So how do we know what data we can believe or understand or look at? And so one of the things that, if you look at the Jenny McCarthy case, you can really just go to her own explanation of the symptoms her son had, that he had ongoing seizures. Now, I'm not saying that seizures don't happen in kids with autism, but that is not a diagnostic factor. In fact, his symptoms would probably diagnose him or put him into a diagnostic category other than autism. So first of all, really looking at all of the millions of cases of diagnosed autism and compare those criteria with what Jenny McCarthy said her son had, then you begin to wonder, did he really have autism? Now, again, I am not an authority, and it doesn't mean that you suddenly become an authority because you ask the question, but ask the question instead of just saying, well, Jenny McCarthy's son has autism. Does he really? Do we know that diagnosis is accurate? Well, the pediatrician gave him that diagnosis. Could the pediatrician be wrong? Is he an expert in autism? This is critical thinking. And now, just because you don't like a diagnosis and you try to go find someone who's going to give you the diagnosis you like, that's not critical thinking. That is confirmation bias, right? When you've already decided what the outcome should be, and then you seek out the experts to get you to that outcome, that is not critical thinking. So you might think you're critically thinking because you think the doctor you're talking to is wrong, because you have a bias. You've decided what's wrong with you, and so you're going to find someone who tells you what that's supposed to be. So don't get those two things confused. But in Jenny McCarthy's case, and if I could use I do like to have empathy for people, right? So if I were to be empathetic, Jenny McCarthy had a pediatrician who was an anti-vaxxer. So am I surprised that she's going to go onto Google and find websites that confirm her bias about vaccines? Absolutely. And there's a component in some vaccines, derivative type of mercury that is in some vaccines. It's a small dose, but there's this, again, a belief that the mercury is poisonous because you can get mercury poisoning, and that's what's causing the autism. And yet, when you really if you really research what does mercury poisoning look like, especially in children, none of the symptoms compare to the symptoms you see with autism. In fact, kids with true mercury poisoning will get pink skin that sloughs off and scales off. And you don't see that in autism. So my point being that it's easy through these categories of logical fallacies to fall into this trap, because not intentionally, but Jenny McCarthy, intentionally or unintentionally, her arguments were based on an appeal to emotion and popularity. So the second component of this is she has a platform. She's on Oprah. I want to be on Oprah. Actually, anyway, that's another story. But I would love to. I think any YouTube platformer might like to be on Oprah. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know if that's even making any sense. But popularity in terms of a category for a logical fallacy. So now you have these two components that are going to lead us as humans down this road of emotion, popularity, and so that sets up a recipe for logical fallacies. And within appeal to emotion and popularity, you will find all types, you could apply all types of different logical fallacies, right? So Another logical fallacy that was used is that's an appeal to emotion is faulty generalization, right? So in the COVID vaccine, for example, there have been a small number of cases, under 1,000, I think. I should get you that reference so you can check it out yourself. That or maybe even in the hundreds that had some problems with the COVID vaccine, and it caused blood clots, and some died, I think. So I've had individuals that I know who are anti-vaxxers immediately bring that up, even though I might say to them, so the worldwide, we have distributed 2 billion COVID vaccinations, 2 billion. And you're going to take this handful of cases that these individuals had comorbidities, they had other problems when they received the vaccine. You're going to take those few and generalize them over the other 2 billion who have received the vaccine. And so that is a false or a faulty generalization, right? Then we move into further discussion around other logical fallacies. And I'm going to bring up one of my favorite ones, and it's, again, appeal to emotion. When something doesn't go your way, it's sometimes difficult to accept that reality, and so you kind of can make up your own reality. So January 6th, 2021, a group of angry Republican voters who absolutely believed that the election was the United States general election for president was somehow rigged or falsified or stolen, despite all the evidence that had come forward from November to December, all the 60 plus lawsuits that Rudy Giuliani and other lawyers took to the courts. I mean, there's so little evidence that anything happened nefariously in this election. In fact, there were some voters, maybe 5, in Michigan and I think another state, that did vote for their dead spouse, and they voted for Trump. So not for Biden, right? So there's this, because of this incredible fear, so it's an appeal to emotion, right? So the emotion that we're appealing to in this case is fear. It's the case true with Jenny McCarthy. Fear is a very, very powerful emotion. And I'm going to tell you, it's a logical fallacy, right? Emotions are logical fallacies. Again, I'm not saying that emotions aren't important, but when we lead out with emotion to come to a logical conclusion, we're at risk for not critically thinking, right? So there's this fear that the election was stolen. There's this fear of socialism from Democrats, or a fear of some other thing. Whatever it is, there's fear that results in a group of people believing that they now need to go forward and through political violence stop the electoral process in the United States. That's a pretty significant thing in our history that I hope we don't forget. It was literally political violence to disrupt our electoral process. So what does that mean? Or how does that, what's the logical fallacy example that I want to share here? Well, it's with the Republicans who turned around and said, including people I know, loved friends and family, who immediately said, that's Antifa. That's not Republicans. Those aren't Trump supporters, because the only people who can commit violence, political violence, are Antifa and the left, as far as they're concerned. The right doesn't engage in political violence in their minds, right? So confirmation bias is involved in this problem, but also a false equivalency, right? So Antifa has a very different way of engaging in political violence. If you take time to research that, you would understand that there is a certain way that they dress typically. They typically will keep their eyes covered, mask, um, and they would not typically pose as Trump supporters to make this insurrection happen to make the Republicans look bad, right? There's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on there, and a lot of false or a lot of logical fallacies going on there, and that happens because of an appeal to emotion, right? And popularity too, right? Trump is incredibly popular amongst a certain segment of our population. And so you combine those two things together and you're at risk for logical fallacies. So how do we critically think going forward? And I have to say that it is probably impossible for any of us to go to a friend or family member or a loved one and convince them of their logical fallacies. So this is the challenge for all of you viewers, is to check your own logical fallacies, right? I know that some of you that are watching are thinking, well, my husband or my wife or my spouse, my partner, they've got a lot of illogical fallacies, or my mom and dad. That's not really relevant. What's relevant is that you are really cognizant of your own logical fallacies. And where does that begin? It begins with emotional intelligence. It begins with emotional intelligence, which means you understand where your emotions are coming from, what your emotions are about, what triggered them, what they mean. So you have awareness of your own emotions, and emotional intelligence includes empathy, which means you are able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand potentially how they are feeling. So emotional intelligence gives you a check on your logical fallacies and helps to a degree prevent you from logical fallacies. So emotional intelligence is important for critical thinking. And then as you begin to think about, how do I use emotional intelligence? I'm going to check my emotions. Is the reason I'm believing something because it's emotional to me? It frightens me, or it angers me, or it causes me anxiety. First and foremost, start with your emotion. Where is that coming from? And don't be careful about applying that to an end conclusion in an argument. It really needs to start with your own emotional intelligence. Now, how do you know if evidence, as you are, let's say that you've checked your emotion, there's an issue at hand, and it might be vaccines, or it might be religion, or it might be politics, right? How do you know that when you do your Google research, because that's where we do our research now, I go to Google. So how do I know that the information that I'm reading and learning about is evidence that I can rely on? Well, it's a couple of different things. So evidence is reproducible. So I give the example of 2 billion vaccines being given across the globe for COVID. And what that has done is it has caused the COVID numbers to decline, and 2 billion people are safe. They're not having side effects. They're not having some weird thing happen that maybe people are conspiracy thinking about. And so that is evidence because it's been reproduced in one person, the next person, over and over. You have tried it on 2 billion people, not 5 people, but a huge sample size that ensures that it's reproducible. So an example of when something's not reproducible. I loved to tease my little sister about my own magical abilities. I would make her think I could do something magical. Well, I'll give a better example that's more fun. My older sister tried to make me believe that she's Wonder Woman. And I'm like, okay. And I was in love with Linda Carter Wonder Woman version back in the day. Just so you know, I was very curious. Is that my sister really? So I I asked her, okay, turn into Wonder Woman. So she goes into her bedroom, and an hour and a half later, she comes out in like a swimming suit and a cape. And I'm like, this is BS. But one of the things that could have happened is she could have come out in looking like Wonder Woman. Let's just say that happened. I would want for that to be evidence that she's really Wonder Woman. That would need to be reproduced over and over and over again. She would need to turn into Wonder Woman over and over again. And she would also need to show me her ability to jump over the house. She would have to show me that the lasso of truth works, and that it works over and over and over and over again and has a 90% success rate, right? So when you're looking for evidence and you're wondering if the information you're looking at is evidentiary, then look at the scale of producibility. Has this data been reproduced and scaled over time? So why can evolution be considered evidence? Because there is reproducible evidence over time by all kinds of scholars, right? So, and they criticize, they peer review each other and critically think and criticize each other until they chip away at the truth to find the truth, and then that's reproduced over and over again until they can claim the evidence. Peer review is another example. That's why I like to look at articles that have been published in journals that have legitimate peer review, where peer reviewers and have your peers have criticized your work and questioned your evidence. It's to say, well, I don't know if your evidence is accurate. Did you think about this? That's really healthy, and that proves out evidence as well. So reproducibility, peer review is important for understanding evidence, and then primary source. So I have another example. A family member of mine during the Obama administration was sure that Obama was going to ruin the country, make it a communist country, and that the US dollar was going to discontinue, and that there would be a new currency, and it would be China's currency. And this family member was absolutely sure. And I asked her, well, where did you hear this? Well, this guy on Facebook that I really like and I really trust him. I mean, you can totally trust him, Gary. So I just asked her, can I see the post from this guy on Facebook? So she handed me her phone, where he had made a prediction that in July of like 2000, and I forget what year it was, maybe it was 2012, the US dollar would be worth nothing, and there would be a new currency, and it would be like and he didn't even say what the new currency would be. I think it may be Chinese currency or something. And that is diabolically opposed to the actual evidence of the time and the evidence today. The strongest currency worldwide is the US dollar. Every other currency is based on the US dollar. The US dollar can be used in every economy across the globe. Every economy. So it is the global currency. And when I said that to her, she dismissed it. Well, Obama's ruining that, right? So confirmation bias. And so then I said, well, I'm going to look into this guy further. So what's the primary source of this data she has from Facebook? So I followed his name, and I did a literature review or Google search on this guy who was making these claims. What I find out about him is that he is a silver and gold dealer. So what he wants is for you to buy gold and silver, and so if he can tell you that the US dollar is not going to be worth anything, I'll tell you, so what did he do? He created fear and panic Now here's my solution for your fear and panic. Buy my gold or buy my silver, right? And that, now I'm not saying, I have friends that think silver is a great investment and they use logic and evidence to make those decisions. I have no problem with that. What I am using as an example here is that my family member had not investigated that primary source any further to really understand where his prediction was even coming from, right? And he had no reasons or evidence or explanations as to why. He just had a bunch of fear-mongering comments and then send you out to his website where you can buy gold and you can buy silver. So, can I change her mind? No. But what can I do? I can check myself. What can you do? Check yourself. Please. That's the best thing that you can do, is to check primary sources, understand the evidence, and is it reproducible evidence over space and time and over large populations? Has it been peer-reviewed? We'll talk more about peer review as we discuss mapping the Bigfoot genome. I have some personal experience with that. And at the end of the day, when you are able to make decisions based on critical thinking, skills that you're learning, then you can feel confident in the decisions that you're making. So that when you do decide to make an investment decision, whether it's in real estate or whether it's in silver, you're making those decisions based upon evidence that you have searched, that you have read, that you know has been peer-reviewed. And by the way, peer review yourself. You might come up with information that you think makes sense to make a decision on an investment. Peer review yourself and ask peers of yours what they think. Ask other people what they think. Doesn't mean that they're right. Ask experts what they think. But it checks you again and again and helps you refine your decision making so you can feel confident in the decisions that you're making. And I want to end with this. One of the mistakes that we make, and I get this is kind of a pet peeve of mine, but when we talk about evidence, we sometimes talk about, so I'll hear some people say, well, evolution is just a theory. There's really no evidence for it, well, there's no evidence for what we see in Genesis either. But regardless, let's just say let's address this question about the theory of evolution. It's just a theory. Well, a theory, we misuse that word. A theory is a theorem or a body of evidence, a body of study. So the Pythagorean theorem, we would never say that the Pythagorean theorem is just a theory. The Pythagorean theorem is a body of study and literature and evidence that that proves this outcome, or is the evidence for this outcome. In terms of the Pythagorean theorem, that's true for evolution. The theory of evolution is the umbrella. A theory is the umbrella for a field of study that has laws associated, hypotheses that have been proven or disproven, etc. So if you're going to say, I have a theory, and you're going to postulate something, please stop saying you have a theory. You have a hypothesis, and you're postulating in your hypothesis that X, Y, and Z might be true. Then you go get the evidence, prove it, reproduce the evidence, have someone else reproduce the evidence. In fact, have your greatest critic reproduce the evidence. And when all those things have proven out, you can then add your hypothesis to the body of literature that might fall under that theory. Now, if you're really, really smart, maybe it is a new field of study and you can create a full body of evidence underneath a new theory. But a theory is an overarching category. So anyway, please say you have a hypothesis, not a theory. And a theory is filled with proven laws and evidence. The same thing with the theory of gravity, right? There are laws within gravitational theories or theory that make up that field of study. So think of theory as the field of study, and think of when you have when you want to postulate something, that's a hypothesis. So I really look forward to continued discussions. This is probably one of my most favorite topics. Critical thinking, logical fallacies. I'm happy to have more discussions around this. So if you want to talk more, or you have some follow-up topics you want to discuss, just put them in the comments below. And remember to have empathy. It's easy to be critical of those around us when we start to see their own flaws. Well, pull the mote out of or the beam out of your eye, as Jesus would say, before you go around taking the mote out of other people's eyes. Be empathetic, love, we're better together. Peace out.